Hello, I'm Ed Vasquez from the Agricultural Research Service and the Eastern Oregon Agriculture Research Center, here to present today's Ag Minute. This week we'll be discussing the eastern movement of cattle from the Oregon country. The breeding of cattle in the Pacific Northwest dates from the pursuit of this region by the fur traders and missionaries, but it wasn't until the extensive migration of American settlers to the Willamette Valley began, a migration that was well underway by 1843, that cattle entered the Oregon country in considerable numbers. During the 1840s and the 1850s, cattle multiplied rapidly in the Pacific Northwest, particularly in western Oregon. Mining activity provided the incentive for the expansion of the cattle business in the American Northwest. In the mining communities of British Columbia, eastern Oregon, central Idaho, and western Montana, the demand for food became enormous. To satisfy this demand, cattle began moving from western Oregon. During the 1860s, cattlemen moved their herds from western Oregon to grasslands in eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, and beyond, and thus opened up vast new cattle country. This movement continued into the 1870s. However, by the early 1870s, cattlemen in the Pacific Northwest were facing a serious problem. The markets in the mining areas had failed, or were failing, and the markets in the growing towns of western Oregon and western Washington were proving to be inadequate to their needs. This week, we're discussing the eastern movement of cattle from the Oregon country. Because of the failing markets in the mining areas and growing towns of western Oregon and Washington, a depression began in 1872, which was destined to be one of great intensity and long duration. The average price for cattle began to drop from $22 in 1870 to about $12 by 1877. In the fall of 1879, at Primeville, cattle from yearlings up sold for $10 to $12 a head, with calves thrown in. Although the depression in the cattle business in the Pacific Northwest was a consequence of overexpansion, the trend of cattle prices for the entire United States during the late 1870s and early 1880s closely resembled the trend of such prices in the Oregon country. Though generally cattlemen were unwilling to resort to measures of desperation, many looked upon an experiment which offered at least a possibility of opening to them markets outside their own region. That experiment consisted of canning beef for an export trade. If Australia could put beef in tin cans and ship this product to Great Britain, why could not the Oregon country do likewise? During the season when the salmon canneries were not being used to put up salmon, these canneries might be employed to process beef. However, by the end of 1877, it was clear that beef canning on the Columbia River was an enterprise which gave no promise of relieving the depressed cattle industry of the Pacific Northwest. This week we're discussing the eastern movement of cattle from the Oregon country. Thus far we have dealt with cattlemen in the Columbia Basin, men whose herds were far removed from a railroad. In southwestern Idaho and southeastern Oregon, however, cattlemen were in a somewhat different situation, for the Central Pacific Railroad gave them easy access to the best markets in California. Arena newspaper, which late in 1870 asserted that 227 head of beef cattle had been driven from Baker County, Oregon to Winnemucca in order that they might be sent by railroad from that point to California. Because of its favorable situation, Winnemucca soon became, and for several years remained, the capital of an intermountain cattle province which comprised of northwestern Nevada, southwestern Idaho, and southeastern Oregon. Before the end of the 1870s, cattle were moving east by railroad from points in Nevada. And by the middle of the 1880s, California buyers were competing with eastern buyers for Oregon and Nevada cattle. Reports speculate that at least 100,000 head of cattle were driven eastward from Oregon, Washington, and Idaho during 1879. The movement of cattle eastward from Oregon country reached its culmination in 1880. In 1881, a newspaper in the heart of southeastern Oregon cattle country reported that more than 200,000 head of cattle had been moved eastward from the Pacific Northwest in 1880. Other reports are more conservative and estimate the drive from Oregon, Washington, and Idaho into Wyoming at about 150,000 head, which found a ready market further east. This week we're discussing the eastern movement of cattle from the Oregon country. Whatever it may have been, the number of cattle moved eastward from the Pacific Northwest in 1880 was very large, possibly between 150 and 200,000 head of cattle. However, owing in part at least to the severe winter of 1880-81, a winter which decimated herds throughout the Pacific Northwest, the movement of cattle eastward from Oregon country in 1881 appears to have been relatively light. Interestingly, by the autumn of 1883, a change was impending in the cattle trade from the Pacific Northwest to eastern markets. By the middle of the 1880s, The eastward cattle trade from the Pacific Northwest had been transformed. The railroads had made the cattle markets of the Middle West easily accessible to the cattlemen of the Pacific Northwest. By this time, the cattlemen could send their fat beeves by rail from nearly every part of the Oregon country direct to the stockyards in Chicago or to slaughtering places in other cities of the Middle West. The price of cattle in the Pacific Northwest continued to advance until 1885. In January 1885, the average price for oxen and other cattle in Oregon was about $27, a price considerably higher than that of January 1877, which was about $12. Despite a sharp rise in the price of beef in the region early in the 1880s, there was no beef famine in the Pacific Northwest and no great scarcity of cattle. This week we've been discussing the eastern movement of cattle from the Oregon country. Because cattlemen in the Oregon country could sell their cattle in a rising market east of the Rockies for a few years, the prices of cattle in the Pacific Northwest remained high. Even though there was a decline in price for the best grade beef in Chicago between 1885 and 1889, the number of beef cattle had been increased in the Pacific Northwest. According to estimates of the United States Department of Agriculture, the total number of oxen and other cattle in Idaho, Oregon, and Washington in 1884 was about 970,000, whereas their total number of cattle in 1889 was about 1.5 million. Many of these cattle, however, were on farms. Within that period of years, the number of cattle on the ranges of the Pacific Northwest dwindled greatly. The rapid decline of the range cattle interest in the Pacific Northwest during the 1880s should not be permitted to obscure the immediate major significance of the eastern movement of cattle from the Oregon country between 1875 and 1885. Within that decade, a business that through long years had been regional broke the bonds of its isolation. Early in that period, cattle from the Pacific Northwest began to enter national and international markets, and thus for the first time, cattlemen of the Oregon country began to envision for themselves freedom from dependence from local and California markets. This is Ed Vasquez. Thanks for listening, and have a great weekend.